Thanks, Doug, and thanks for everybody for coming, especially the Conneys and the 92nd Street Y for hosting this year. I've been coming to the Conney several iterations, and this is the only time when I drove across Pennsylvania from Pittsburgh to come to New York where I encountered snow on my way to the Conney. And it's ironic because it's usually in Wisconsin, but this year, something different. Sure. Is that better? This talk is a little bit more out of the character for me. I'm going to show a couple of images of my work, talk about what they might mean, and then enter into some creative conversations with myself that you get to listen to. And the questions I'm going to answer that are really of particular interest to me might be of interest to you too. The work that I've been doing since beginning at the Conney, since 2007, has centered on the Eruv. The Eruv, as some of you might know, is a boundary that's traced around an Orthodox or traditional community, and it is a way to build community almost in a literal sense. Orthodox Jews, many of them abide by the 39 rules of Shabbat, one of which, the rules that are prohibited, one of them is to not carry from the private to the public space. So imagine I have a house in Pittsburgh, there's a fence around my yard. I can carry things into that yard because it's my private yard, and there's a fence that shows it to me. My neighbors, George and Debbie, also have a fence, and let's suppose that they also abide by this rule. So we each can then carry something into our yard. The fence between our two properties might have a gate, and now I can carry from my yard, that has a fence around it, to my neighbor's fenced-in yard and pretend that these two yards have then been blended. That would be an Eruv. An Eruv then can be traced around an entire neighborhood and become like a garden wall. And people can then carry food to their neighbor to celebrate Shabbat together. The work in the middle of this slide is a map based on the Eruv in Beit Shemesh. It has two different colored threads traced through the paper. And it looks as if we've got two different rabbinical decisions on how to interpret rabbinical law. The laws of the Eruv are written in the Gemara and the Mishnah, and they're rather intensive on how they're constructed. The image on the left, instant Eruv, is a playful idea of what it might be like to go to the store, buy a thread, and make your own for the weekend or wherever else you might need one. And the image on the right is where I'm thinking now, is actually getting much more into the text of the Gemara and the Mishnah, and illustrating to some degree what the debates between the rabbis are. This one is called Architectural Folly 2a, and the 2a refers to the page from Talmud that they're discussing the height of a window. Does the window in the wall break the Eruv boundary if it's too low? Or does it appropriately maintain that boundary at a certain height? This is my thinking on the Eruv, rather technical. And recently I've gotten a little more playful, but still fairly technical, looking at the laws of the mikvah, the ritual bath. I'm less interested in who needs to use it and when, and more interested in how it's made. There are certain key words that, while reading about it, have rung in my ear, such as different bodies of water come together, and the Hebrew expression is the bodies of water kiss. So I've included that iconographic reference in all of these pictures. Another idea about it is that the water is living, that it comes from the rain or it comes from a stream, something that hasn't yet been collected by man, and it can be mixed with other water. This living water, or mayim, living water, I turned it into another word. You may know the Scandinavian liquor aquavit. It has the same term, the same word, but a very different thing. This one, the series is called Aquavit, and this is Aquavit Straw. I'm sorry, this is Aquavit Straw. And this is Aquavit Da Vinci. I had in mind the hydrodynamic illustrations that Leonardo da Vinci made with barrels and water pressure. And this last one, Blue Faucet, also from the same series. So altogether, these are a bit more imaginative, a bit more playful. I am inspired by the rules that come from these texts, but I don't necessarily follow them as strictly as I had been doing with the original Eruv maps. what's been occupying the back of my mind? Imagine, as I'm reading these, there are debates within these texts, and occasionally there'll be a person who isn't a rabbi or a sage speaking. Sometimes it's a philosopher. And in my background and my education, I'm much more familiar with what the philosophers have said than the sages, and they're starting to have an argument in my mind. So that's where this title of this talk comes from. The philosopher has a lot to say about what I might know, particularly if the philosopher and the rabbi were sitting at a table. They might talk about the person who made that table. What does the woodworker need to know? Well, the woodworker would need to know about tools and how to cut the wood and how to assemble the wood. And the philosopher has particular words for that. And I've been a little, the question in my back of my mind would be, well, what does the rabbi say, Jewish texts have to say about the woodworker? Is there something a bit more specific that our texts can offer me as someone who makes stuff? The philosopher has names for this kind of knowledge. So let's pretend that we can listen to these two people speaking at the table across the room. And we're sitting at a table of our own with a couple of other friends that I'll introduce as they interject and they can't withhold what they want to say. Our philosopher sounds a little bit like Aristotle and Plato, and he mentions things that sound like they come from the Nicomachean Ethics or Plato's Republic. And the philosopher describing what the woodworker knows says the woodworker knows techne, knowledge of how things are made. Now, since architecture is an art and is essentially a reasoned state or capacity to make, he says, there is neither any art that is not such a state, nor any state that is not an art. Therefore, the art craftsman knows things, and it's a reasoned state. Well, that's nice. There's also another kind of knowledge he talks about, and it's episteme. It's knowledge of that something is true. I know that 2 + 2 is 4, that the sky is blue. And then finally, the philosopher across the room puffs out his chest, puts his face in a position of pride, and says the most important is phronesis, practical knowledge. Those who know about action that benefits another person. Just as the rabbi is about to speak, Stephen Parcell at our table, who happened to write the book 4 Historical Definitions of Architecture, leans in and whispers, with the rise of the theoretical mode of knowledge in classical Greece, the status of the artisan began to decline, especially in crafts that require more physical effort than mental effort. The growing attention to contemplative and democratic life led to rankings within the category of techne. Xenophon explained it differently. Monastic occupations, physical jobs, leave no spare time for friendship or the affairs of the city. The man next to Stephen says, there are a few different kinds of sorts of physical labor. The banasoi or the monastic occupations are akin to the day laborer or workman. His livelihood depends on how much he can get done in any one day, so he doesn't stop working. The demiurgoi might be the same type of work, but they sometimes have a bit more skill. They go out of their home and work for the public. Well, really they work in the public. Parcell nods and continues his conspiratorial tone. Monastic crafts that require a physical labor were considered inferior because they debased the mind and the body and drew one's attention away from virtuous activities. So, this conversation suddenly talks about who knows how, not just what they know. The philosopher hears him, rises to his feet, and calls across the room to our table. It is by virtue of one's techne that one belongs to the polis, meaning you have a place in society by what you do. A couple of heads nod at our table, but it feels like not everybody's so comfortable with this. The philosopher continues, those who possess and exercise knowledge related to manual work in one realm, while those who possess and exercise knowledge related to philosophical or ethical behavior work in another realm. It's that later realm that is the free. They are the liberal disciplines. The room falls silent for a minute. People seem to be adjusting what the philosopher is saying about work and status. "Let's hear from the rabbi," somebody calls out. Taking the floor, as it were, the rabbi, clearly pleased to have an audience, turns to everyone in the room. "Craft knowledge in Torah isn't found in any one place," he begins. "In fact, very few topics in Torah are found in any one place, and we do not really have experts like my friend at this table. Rather, we all work together to figure these things out." A few at our table nod. "My good friend here has introduced several important ideas. He defined certain kinds of knowledge. He described who holds that knowledge. He placed those people in a kind of hierarchy in society based on what they do. Nies, a professor at our table, has suggested something else. He says, we've got a problem. We've moved from talking about knowledge to talking about who has the knowledge. Professor Nies would prefer to call that first step of the knowledge a strict sense of techne. The hammer strikes. That's a strict idea. But once you think about the carpenter, Professor Nies says, we've stepped into something else. Who has it? The rabbi describes Bezalel as no ordinary artist, the man who is charged with building the Mishkan and everything within it. He is endowed with a divine spirit of skill, ability, and knowledge in every kind of craft. But such knowledge isn't base or low at all. In fact, the two of the endowed qualities he has are Chachma and Bina that appear on the Kabbalistic tree of life, and they both sit just under the top. The rabbi continues that Bezalel is given very important divine qualities by that description. But what does Bezalel precisely know? Well, the Mishnah explains that the expert in craft knows many things: how to plow, winnow, grind, weave, shear, cut, slaughter, and others. These tasks are derived from what was necessary to build the Mishkan and everything within it. The Mishnah lists these activities and calls them the melachot, the creative acts, but does not explicitly describe who, other than Bezalel and those who worked with him, had that knowledge. The Mishnah does not say the knowledge of the woodworker. The Mishnah does say the knowledge of the perfumer. It's not listed here. And so we might think of the melachot as techne, in the strict sense, a list of creative acts, like Professor Nies suggested. The rabbi gestures to the philosopher, and the philosopher nods his head. That's a possibility. If the melachot are a list of techne in the strict sense, can they be organized in such a way to create more robust, reasoned methods of making? Absolutely. The melachot are already understood to be parts of more extended process of construction and creation, such that they outline the reasoned, ordered process that the baker, weaver, and tanner use all the time. Looked at as techne, the melachot are sorted and given to certain occupations. They can be reorganized and create different forms of knowledge of making as well. Looked at as techne, then, this knowledge is no longer free-floating, but tethered to certain occupations. Just as Nies pointed out, we should be aware that we go from knowledge to person. We are now discussing who holds the knowledge and how they demonstrate their knowledge. The Mishnah listing of the specific melachot found in Mishnah Shabbat leaves the list of activities ambiguous. But another Mishnah does not. It lists specific tasks. A person should not sit down before the barber close to afternoon prayers until he prays, nor should he enter the bathhouse, or a tannery, or start eating, or judging in court. But if he did, he should finish and then continue with his prayer. This Mishnah from Mishnah Shabbat talks about someone who needs to go somewhere for a service or a product. They leave their private space and go out to another space in order to receive that service. Another one says, the tailor may not go out with his needle close to nightfall, and the scribe may not go out with his pen lest he forget and start working. These people take their tools with them to perform their work. Are they demiurgoi? Are they working for or in the public? So the demiurgoi, whose work serves the public, that is, benefits those outside the domestic sphere, are prohibited from doing their work not only because sewing and stitching and writing letters are prohibited on the Sabbath, but also that going out is prohibited. And therefore, my friend, the rabbi says to the philosopher, even your banasoi and demiurgoi, who work all day long and work until they are fed, commanded time on the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. But on the seventh is a Sabbath unto the Lord. On it you shall not do any manner of work, your son, your daughter, your servant, your maidservant, your cattle, and the stranger that is within your limits. Therefore, the banasoi can be like the philosopher king. They don't have to work 1 day of the week. They might engage in friendships. They might engage in ethical and philosophical contemplation, and they might pray and engage in devotional worship. With that, our table applauds the sudden turn to the discussion, and we can return to this room once again. Are the melachot a kind of techne in the strict sense? I think so. Why are the instructions for the eruv and the mikveh and so many other things so precise and detailed? Maybe because it's not only instructions, but a kind of knowledge. Maybe, if I push it a bit further, a Jewish techne. Why can't we carry from the domestic into the public, and the eruv helps us work out a solution to that rule? Maybe it isn't just a religious outline of a way to observe the Sabbath, but maybe it also reflects some economic life that the Jews during this period were negotiating with their fellow citizens. Thank you very much.